Metaphors of EdTech. I'll come back to the Jaws theme cover later, maybe. So outline talk, I'm going to take a little detour at the start to talk about narrative, and then come on to the role of metaphors, why I think they're important in education technology, talk a bit about the online pivot that happened during the pandemic, and then look at some examples of metaphors that are in the book, and also talk about some of the dangers of metaphors or issues around them, and some conclusions at the end. So, quick detour, it's really just a way of me getting to plug two books in one talk, really. So I'm going to talk about previous book, 25 Years of EdTech, that I wrote. And in some ways, the metaphor book is a kind of companion to that. Although, as people like to say on Netflix, you can watch this as a standalone movie, but so they stand alone. But I think there's a proposal that metaphor and narrative are the two dominant ways by which we come to understand the world. And those two forms tend to dominate different fields. So you might find physics is dominated by metaphor, and say biology by narrative or histories. So those two ways of coming at the world are sort of ingrained in us as people. And so, if you like, the 25 Years book can be seen as the narrative attempt at trying to understand educational technology. So it's openly licensed, published by Athabasca University Press, and that came out in 2019, I think. And perhaps more fun is after it came out, some people I know, Clinton Alon said he wanted to do an audio book, and he got people in to sort of read each chapter and released it openly. And then Laura Pasquini said, why don't we do a podcast where people discuss it as well? So each week there would be like an audio book, an audio chapter released, and then a podcast about people talking about that chapter. And actually, I think those discussions ended up being much more interesting than the book, because the book was a kind of a launching pad for people to have really interesting discussions about different technologies. So the approach of that book was, I was the president of ALT, the Association for Learning Technology, and in their 25th year, I decided to do a blog post about choosing a technology every year from 1994 at the time, and it was based on my experience and when I thought they became significant. So it wasn't like a deep historical dive about when they were invented or something. And having written the blog series, there was unprecedented demand, i.e. One person mentioned it to me, so why don't you turn that into a book? And I think that was a good idea. So so the reason I wrote that book was for a number of reasons. That there was I think one of the things we have in education technology is often people come into the field from other fields. My background was in psychology and then AI, Beck's from philosophy and so on. And I think that's really useful in the field. It's what makes it a rich field. But often it means we don't have a kind of shared understanding that you might have in a more kind of formulated discipline like chemistry or whatever. Another thing I wanted to do was kind of refute the sort of claim you often see that higher education is so slow, it never innovates, it needs Silicon Valley to come along and innovate for it, kind of thing. So I wanted to demonstrate this history of innovation that's been happening over the past sort of 25 years. And I thought, and having done that, having set out to look at these things independently, then when I got to the end, it was quite interesting kind of to see if there were any kind of themes that emerged for myself or anyone else. And I think also I wanted to highlight the importance of having a critical approach. It wasn't just like, hey, wow, the new technology. Because I think with the benefit of hindsight, you can see these things weren't important or they didn't work out the way we thought they might do. So I was trying to sort of provide this alternative historical narrative to this one that we often get forced upon us, the kind of Silicon Valley narrative about, everything's only invented this year. There's this historical amnesia, and we've got to come along and disrupt everything rather than a kind of incremental building on previous knowledge, which is what I was trying to portray. So the images are all done by Brian Mathers. So for those of you know, I'm a visual thinker. So this was kind of like a cartoon he did for me, and we've seen this over and over again. It's like in 94, like when the internet was new, newish or web was new. It's like, hey, we've invented online learning. Then MOOCs come along. It's like, hey, I was reading all these articles about, that MOOCs are higher education discovering the internet. And I was like, really? That's news to me. I thought we've been doing this for quite some time. And then in 2019, we had the pandemic, and everyone's going, hey, look, we can do online learning. And you just feel like, oh my God, we're just going over the same stuff over and over again. So that was a kind of narrative approach, I think. And then a couple of years later, I was going back over my blog, and I was thinking, just in this, and in my blog, I often use metaphor as a kind of playful way of writing, and just because I think it's fun, but also I think it's a kind of useful way to understand things. I was thinking I actually had quite a lot of content around metaphors, and that would make a good kind of book too. So I set about writing a book around metaphors of EdTech. And I think it's important to think about the role of metaphors in our cognitive setup, if you like. So the kind of influential work in this area was by Lakoff and Johnson, Metaphors We Live By, which came out in 1980. And they were psychologists, and they were saying that these aren't just tools that we use in poetry or literature. They're actually fundamental to how we come to understand the world, and they are sort of evasive across all our language. And often we don't even notice that we're using them, and they shape our language and the way we think. And that kind of elevating the cognitive significance of metaphors was quite groundbreaking at the time. So there's a kind of simple way metaphors work is you map from one domain to another. So if you don't understand something, one way to come to understand it is to use a metaphor. So we have the source domain, which is the thing you do understand, and the target domain, which is the thing you're trying to understand. And you map across some characteristics and say, oh, it's like this. So we often have these in education, so you might say electricity, which is the thing you don't understand, is like flowing water in the same way that it tends to go down different channels, those kind of things. And there's lots of different metaphors. But it's important to understand that not all characteristics map across, because if they all mapped across, then it would be the same thing. And it's obviously not. So it's important to understand which things aren't the same. But also there's kind of more generative metaphor, which is like a dialogue between the two domains. So metaphors have quite a strong power, quite powerful for us. And I think I like this idea of them, a metaphor being an interaction between two fields. And I think that's the approach I've taken much more in the book, because often the metaphors I'm using are areas that aren't known to people either. So I use a metaphor about my local castle, which I can see from my window, which I'm not expecting everyone to know the history of my local castle, but by talking about that and how I use that metaphor to explain how Silicon Valley and the computer companies want to have part of education under their remit. I think there's a kind of interaction between those two things that can help deepen our understanding. And I think one of the really interesting things about metaphors is they help shape our solution. So there are variations on this experiment done in psychology. So you have two groups of subjects and you give them some accounts of something. So in this case, they gave one group of subjects different accounts of crime in a community. And for one group, it was couched in terms of it being a disease. And then in another group, crime was couched in a metaphor of it being a monster, kind of like ravaging the community. And then they asked those two groups to come up with or to rank solutions to crime. And the solutions they prefer were heavily influenced by the metaphor they'd been given. And we see this a lot in politics. It's like politicians will couch something often in a metaphorical term to then make the solution that they want to push through seem like the obvious solution. We also see it in technology, in that lots of companies or individuals, if they're trying to sell you an idea, will couch it in terms of a metaphor. So then, like, oh, their solution that they just happen to have seems like the obvious things there. So in some ways, I think being aware that you're being sold a metaphor is an important thing. So to conclude, the reason why I think metaphors in educational technology are important, three things, if you like. One is understanding. Educational technology is a relatively new field. New things are coming along all the time. AI is currently taxing lots of us, and metaphors provide a useful way of coming to understand this new field. and think about its implications. The second is what you might call defense. I think it goes back to the idea of metaphors shaping a solution. So understanding when you're being given a metaphor and having some sense of how to combat the power of metaphors when you're trying to be sold a particular solution or particular idea. And the last one is fun. I think, I think metaphors allow us to reason in a very kind of creative manner and a more kind of humane way about technology, rather than often very kind of dry ways of thinking about it. We all have roadmaps and spreadsheets and rollout plans and KPIs, and all those things are important for technology implementation. But also, I think we need to think about them in a kind of human context. So talking about fun, you can, if you want to zone out for the rest of this talk, you can. If you go to metaphor.edtechie.net, I created a metaphor generator. So you can go there. That's a picture of my dog Tylo. Get a metaphor if you like that you like. If you don't like the one that it's got, just click on the give me another one, and it will randomly generate educational technology metaphor. So if you come across one you like, stick it in the chat. Cool. So onto the book. So I wrote a book which came out at the end of last year, in the end, called Metaphors of EdTech, again published by lovely people at Athabasca University Press, so openly licensed. You can download it for free, and feel free to order the paperback version. That's always nice too. And whereas the previous book, 25 Years of EdTech, stopped just before the pandemic, I was writing this one during the pandemic. And we went through the idea of the online pivot, when suddenly all education had to shift online, and we saw educational technology kind of really move centre stage. I think probably less so in the OU, but certainly in other universities. People, lots of my colleagues who are EdTech people, were kind of previously tucked away in a little office somewhere, or suddenly we're getting calls from the vice chancellor, quick, we need to move everything online. And it was interesting to go through that period, and I think often revealed a lot of ignorance about online education. So here's a quote. I think this was from Inside Higher Ed article. And this, these people, the main reason why distance learning revolution, you can see they're almost spitting those words out, didn't replace the traditional model, is that online learning just isn't as good. I think we at the OU might refute that, but it's what it revealed to me was that we have this kind of lecture deficit model. The face-to-face lecture is seen as the only way to do things, and everything that isn't that is operating on a deficit model. And I think that revealed a kind of real lack of alternative mental models people have for online education, which is why I think thinking in terms of metaphors might help expand that repertoire of online learning ways of thinking. And I think this was reinforced by lots of things we saw as the pandemic was coming to an end. We saw these kind of headlines like universities refused to end online lessons. They were going to cut fees if they didn't get everyone back to face, and universities warned to return or face fines. It was almost like online education was some form of abuse. The way it's sort of pitched, it's like face to face is the only way to teach. That was quite maddening and saddening in a way. I think, have we learned nothing after all this time? And I think I did a lot of talks around the time of the pandemic. How am I doing for time? And people asking for advice about how they shift their learning online. And something I often talk about was architecture does a lot of the work for us in a campus building, and we don't really notice that. So we turn up. People turn up to a lecture at a certain time in a lecture hall to receive content. They go to another room for a seminar, which is shaped differently to have discussion. They go to the library for resources. So all these buildings are doing all that work for you, for the student and for the academics in many ways, and they're sort of designing your work. And when you move online, you have to, and I know I don't need to tell people at the OU this, but you have to implement a lot of that very explicitly. And also I think there's a lot of financial investment goes into that architecture. And I would also think there's probably quite a bit of ego. Whenever you see lots of universities, campus universities, where they get a new vice chancellor, the first thing they do is like start building a new building. They want to be this their kind of legacy, the kind of shiny new building. And I think it's important to understand that online learning and online architecture of that learning requires as much effort, but it's different. And I think trying to get people to understand that was quite a challenge during that period. So onto the book. I have a wide range of metaphors in the book. So if you don't like one, you can move on to another one very quickly. And I'm going to try something fancy here. Well, not that fancy. Very basic, Visual Basic programming. So I thought I wouldn't have time to do all of the metaphors in the book. So I chose 8, and I'm going to do a random number for the one we're going to jump to. So are you excited? Number 6, digital mudlarking. Okay, here we go. So those of you who don't know, mudlarks was a term that sort of grew up around Victorian times, particularly around the Thames in England, in London. And they were generally poor children, the sort of very kind of Dickensian type atmosphere, who would make their scavenger living really by going down to the Thames and finding bits of food or stuff they could find and sell. But there's been a kind of resurgence in mudlarking recently. There's a very good book out, I'm forgetting the authors, but she talks about how, using metal detectors and kind of how people have got back into mudlarking, trying to find these artifacts and stuff, and go down there. And things like the Thames are a good river for that, because they're a tidal river. A big wave comes in and then goes back out again. And so I was making the analogy. This is rather like being an education technologist. And as we experience these kind of rapid changes, so the tide, that's akin to kind of the tide coming in, something changing and then going out again, and then everything seems to be forgotten until the next tide comes in. And I think part of our role as educational technologists is to go down there when that tide goes out and to find these artifacts, these nuggets. And I think that can be, good pieces of research, things we've come to learn and understand before the next wave comes in and everyone says we don't know anything. So try and overcome that idea of historical amnesia. So an example might be MOOCs. MOOCs come in as a wave, a tidal wave, sweeping everything away. And everyone's like, oh, they're new, aren't they great? And then they recede somewhat, they haven't gone away completely. But then instead of just thinking, oh, that's them gone, I think there was some good research that came out of MOOCs in terms of understanding the use of artifacts and how students engage with online content and the ordering of some of that content. So I think our role as educational technologists is to go and find those useful bits that can be reapplied to future times. So that's digital mudlarking. Okay. So number 2. Okay. Is it Cellini? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Anyway, so I think it's Cellini's Perseus. Cellini was a Renaissance sculptor, and his Perseus stands in a square in Florence, and it's a marvelous piece of work. I did art history, and I went there to see it specifically, and it was created by using bronze casting at a time when everyone was creating statues in marble, and he has this amazing account of its creation. He was struck down by a fever, and he didn't think he'd be able to make it, and then he had a vision that he had to go there and make it, and there's lightning going and there's a big storm, and it's kind of like this big creation myth, and he sort of casts it whilst he's ill and stuff, and it sets and stuff. But the technique that he developed and the statue itself demonstrates is a much more kind of dynamic, allows for much more kind of dynamic sculpture. So you can see the blood pouring from Medusa's head there, and you couldn't really do that in marble, so it kind of allowed this kind of much more kind of visceral kind of creation. And there are whole articles written about the blood of Medusa's head in this statue. So I think in some ways that casting technique provides an example of this new technique allowing new types of ways of working. and we see this often in in education technology, that new technologies come along which allow us to do different things. But I thought was interesting is how you can also see this Perseus statue as replicating existing power structures. So Medusa is often used as a symbol of misogyny, and the man slaying the evil woman, and there was reportedly it was meant to be a kind of message about the powerful women who were coming to play roles at the time. So even though we have these new ways of working, they often don't overthrow existing power structures. And we see this, for example, lots of open source communities, a new way of developing software, could be very communal based, but there's lots of accounts of them being very male dominated, the work of women undervalued in those spaces, and the types of language used, being very misogynistic or very kind of male oriented. So, and I think we also see it in terms of what you might term open labour. So lots of the work done about care online in places like Twitter and kind of supportive open communities is often done by women or people of colour, but that's not really recognised. So I think it's interesting to think about these new ways of working come along. They don't always change the kind of existing power structures and inbuilt biases, and we might see that with artificial intelligence, of course, as well. That in a way, it's a kind of it will replicate existing biases. Okay, good. I might do another one or two. We've done 6. 1. This one's for you, Bart. Okay, so VAR and learning analytics. It probably doesn't have to be learning analytics. It could be any EdTech, really. So in football, you don't have to be a football fan to get this one. There's this thing called video assisted refereeing, and it's coming into play since about 2018. And first implemented in the Netherlands. And in some ways it was seen as being inevitable. So what happens is there's the referee and the lines people on the pitch, but there's a fourth referee in a different booth who will have access to all the video content and will communicate with the referee if they feel they've missed a decision or to overturn an incorrect decision. And everyone was crying out for this. Everyone kept saying, we've got to have video in football, because there were so many mistakes being made and we had kind of football coverage on TV, which would analyze stuff in the minutest detail. So that there were obvious things, like a goal not being given when a ball had clearly crossed the line and those kind of things. But also then, fouls being missed and those kind of things. And as people argued, that the only person who doesn't have access to video is the most important person, which is the referee in the middle of the pitch. People in the crowd were like filming stuff on their phones and stuff. So it seemed inevitable to have it, and everyone wanted it. And then when it was implemented, I think it's fair to say it's not been an uncontroversial implementation. So there's lots of arguments about VAR. One of the things is that it applies these kind of really minute measurements to what's really quite a messy human enterprise. We have kind of offside decisions by a toenail, or handball because it brushed a hair on their arm, kind of stuff. And it wasn't really the way the sport was designed to be played, even if it's technically correct. And it didn't really fix the problems that we thought it was going to fix. It just relocated them somewhere else. So instead of hating the referee who had missed the call, we now hated the VAR people who had overturned the decision when we didn't think they should do. And it also undermines the human referee in the centre. I think that there's accounts, lots of them feeling like they're not sure if they should give a decision because VR might overturn it, or they don't need to make a call because if they got it wrong, the VR will tell them anyway. And I think there's some interesting analogies here with education technology, in that there's lots of technology that seems inevitable, and I think is inevitable and desired. And I think I chose learning analytics, but perhaps ChatGPT and AI is another one. That's going to come whether we want it or not, and resisting it, I think, is only going to make the clamour for it more. But we shouldn't underestimate the trickiness in implementing it, and it needs to be implemented very sympathetically, I think. And I think the implementation of VR was a very good example of that. Both education and sport are these messy human practices. And everything, why are they there? Sport is ultimately there for entertainment, and lots of people criticize VR because someone scores a goal and they don't know whether to celebrate, so they have to wait 5 minutes for the VAR decision to come. And you think, what's the point of sport? And I think we could ask, if AI can produce essays which can then be marked by AI, what's the point of education? And I think it makes us ask those very fundamental questions. I'll do one more. Educator as DJ. Okay. So I think this comes up in various guises. We had someone visiting the AU quite a long time ago, Scott Leslie, who gave a really good talk about educator as DJ. This was kind of around Web 2.0 times when we were very excited about new content. And I wrote an article called A Pedagogy of Abundance, and Dave Cormier has been expanded on that and has produced a book around that idea. And I think educator as DJ is really a way of thinking about how you operate as an educator in a world with abundant resources. So like a DJ, a kind of mixing DJ, there are different roles. One is to kind of find useful things. So an educator might go out and find interesting things to piece together. They will then sample the useful elements, as a DJ might, like sample a drum beat. So they might sample, I don't need all of this, this open textbook, or I don't need all of this video, I just need this part. And then they remix them into something new. So a DJ will remix into a song, perhaps add in rapping or whatever. And an educator will remix these elements into something new, add in activities, their own explanations on top. And so I think it's an interesting way to think about our role as educators. It's not necessarily to provide all the content, but it's this sequencing and finding and adding context to them. And I think another way to think about the DJ metaphor is when things like Spotify and Last.fm came online, suddenly you didn't need the radio to hear new music. When I was a lad growing up, the only way you would hear new music was through the radio. But now you can have, through Spotify, you can have a personalized playlist, just for you, getting all sorts of music, all the music possibly available. So you might think that would lead to a decrease in listening to radio, but that's not the case. There's been an increase in radio listening, and I think partly that's because people don't just want to listen to music; they like the DJ. The DJ adds the human context to that music, so they have their favourite shows they listen to, and they'll like the music that's played there. But it's really about connecting with the DJ and the audience that DJ sort of fosters. And I think that has a good resonance for being an educator as well. And so you could go off, and learn on your own, sequencing content together, and having AI generate content for you. But that human context is what brings it all together, and that then them acting as the center of a network or a cohort or a community that brings people together. So again, I think there's kind of quite interesting ways for us to think about what our role is as educators in this abundant world where we don't really need to produce the content as much. And I think, an aside, I think the OU is very bad at that. Kind of, we always, but I know we do need to produce all the content ourselves. And I don't think that's true so much. Okay, so I'm going to end with my metaphors there. Oh no, I'm going to do one more. I know you wanted me to do it, so I'm going to talk about Jaws. So the cover of the book, Metaphors of EdTech. See, you've still got the video going. That's the cover. So it's a parody of the famous Jaws poster. So when I was doing it, I worked with Brian Mathers, and he, if you've ever worked with him before, he produces lots of different sketches based on different ideas. We had quite a few fun ones, and I've blogged about the different ones. And I contacted the publisher and said, do you have a preference? They said, no, we trust you, go with what you want. And so we went round and round, and Brian, quite right, said, if you like Jaws, why don't you have Jaws on the cover? And that's my chance to have a Jaws book. But I think it also works quite well as a metaphor. You can say, is the shark educational technology coming for us? Or, or is it the future, or whatever. So you can think about different things for it. But anyway, in the book, I do have a chapter around Jaws. And it came to, there was quite a lot of resonance around the online pivot, I think. So you could think of, so I'm sure you've all seen Jaws, but apparently some people haven't. But you know, so it's a film in two parts really. So the first one, a shark is attacking this beach resort, Amity Island, and then the second half of the film, the three main characters, Brody, who's the chief of police, Hooper, who's a shark scientist, and Quint, who's a hunter, a fisherman, go out in the boat to try and catch the shark. And there's a fabulous character, Mayor Vaughan, in the film, who doesn't want to close the beaches because they're a summer island and they need those summer dollars. And in some ways, you can think of during the pandemic, you know, if the shark was the virus, it really helped expose existing frailties in the system, in the higher education system, just as the shark in Amityville sort of exposes their reliance on summer dollars, you know, their fear of outsiders and those kind of things. You know, and he famously says in the film, those beaches will be open on the 4th of July. And I think that was very similar to lots of people's reaction to universities. You know, those universities will be open back again in September, when it was clearly not safe to do so. And I think, you know, it exposed lots of frailties in the higher education system, and that so much was relied on bringing people together in a campus, a face-to-face campus, and everything else spun off from that. As soon as you closed down the central location, like assessment was based around people doing exams together, access to resources was based around people going to the library and stuff. So lots of those existing frailties, and lots of universities relied on overseas students for money, just as Amity Island relies on summer visitors. So when the shark came along, when the virus came along, these things were already there. Kind of it really exposed them, and I think it was interesting to see how the Open University, in some ways, managed to carry on sort of as normal. And to further the metaphor, I think you can think of our three main protagonists as representing groups in the commerce, in the education triangle. So Brody is the learners, he's the person you want to do good by. Hooper is the intellectual, he's the educators, and Quint is the hard person of commerce. And you think, but who will return from that fishing trip? And also, interestingly, I think it provided a nice. Jaws 2 had the tagline, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. And I think we could argue that, you know, that provided quite a nice tagline for the follow-on for other crises that are now hitting higher education, as the cost of living. You know, just when you thought it was safe to go back to campus, we need to think about other things. So I'm going to finish talking about separate metaphors there. Having been sort of propounding the value of metaphors, I think we need to think about the kind of dangers or issues related to them as well. One is their power. You know, so like with great power comes great responsibility. So because they are very powerful, you can often get swept up in them, and they can be used to persuade people to do bad things. It's like, so I think you need to be very wary of when a metaphor can sort of sweep people along. I think they often go unnoticed in language. You know, they can be quite subtle, and you can use them to persuade people to one way or another, and people don't realise it's really the metaphor they're being sold. They can be quite inclusive, they can bring people together, but they can also exclude people quite a lot. So I talk in the book about a few years ago, a friend of mine, Jim Groom, coined the term edupunk, and it was a fun metaphor. And you know, the metaphor he was applying was just as punk used kind of very DIY approach, you could just take these, anyone could get up there and you know, start a band. So the early tools of the web were like that. You know, anyone can create a website, anyone can teach like this online, and it was quite a fun metaphor. But then it was a real runaway metaphor in the end. One of the things that everyone was talking about. But I think for lots of people, it was really off-putting as well. If you didn't like punk, it just seemed to be mainly these middle-aged white men sort of reliving their youth. So, yeah, punk, yeah. So I think, you know, we have to be very careful about our use of metaphors. Or another way, you know, I might make a metaphor about Scooby-Doo. So, you know, if you know Scooby-Doo cartoon, but if you didn't grow up in the, or perhaps a more UK cartoon. So UK Danger Mouse from the 80s. If you haven't seen Danger Mouse, you didn't grow up in the UK, or aren't old enough to remember Danger Mouse, then if everyone else is going, oh yeah, it's like this, then that can really make you feel like you don't belong in this discussion. So I think we have to be very careful about the use of metaphors. They're imperfect, so I think I mentioned at the start, they're not the same as the thing you're trying to understand. So they're always imperfect, and I think you need to look at which bits don't map across. Often those bits that don't map across are as interesting as the things that do map across. Why is it not like this? And I think a good thing to do is, if you find yourself getting very excited about metaphor that seems to prove the argument you want to make, is to think you could probably come up with a metaphor that would demonstrate the opposite case, and to try and actually to find that, I think. So coming to the end now, and I hope we'll have some time for some chat. One of the things I like about them is the kind of creativity and playfulness around metaphors. So I mentioned, EdTech's often bound and very dry stuff. It's like we're caught up in doing this stuff, and that's what we need to do. But I think there's room for creative thinking in there also. And I think by using metaphors, it can help improve our critical thinking. It's often great to sit around with people, and perhaps it's just me who thinks this is great, but to kind of tease out different metaphors people have for things. I think about the VLE. People often carry very different metaphors in their heads about the VLE and what it is. Is it a walled garden? Is it like a toolbox? Is it something that's kind of imposed upon us? I think people have these kind of different ways of thinking about it that often they don't make explicit, and they assume everyone else has the same metaphor, and often they don't. So I think they're a good way about humanizing our relationship with technology and encouraging discussion. So I've never tried this, but it would be a fun thing to do in somewhere like the OU, alongside our stakeholder consultation and engagement plans and communication plans. Is like, what happens if we ran workshops based around metaphors? We're struggling with ChatGPT and other things at the moment. It's like, maybe we should base it around metaphors to get people to talk about what it is that they fear for it or hope for it, those kind of things. So I'm coming to the end now. Speaking of being playful and anyone can do it and not being professional, I've created a Metaphors of EdTech podcast, so you can subscribe on your various favourite platforms. That's been a fun thing to do, just mainly me chatting about various metaphors in the book, but also inviting some guests along to chat about how they use metaphors. So that's quite fun if you want to go and listen to that if you're really bored. So thank you. So I thought things you might want to discuss, you don't have to. So what role of metaphor is most relevant for you? I mentioned those 3 ways of understanding, defense, creativity, and how might you use metaphor in your practice? I'll share these slides with you after spec, but just to wrap up, there's all the various links there at the end.